Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort, 2014, is a brutal horror film that mixes mystery, survival, gore, and twisted family secrets. It is the sixth installment in the Wrong Turn franchise and follows a young man who unexpectedly inherits an abandoned resort hidden deep in the mountains. What begins as a strange family discovery slowly turns into a horrifying nightmare filled with cannibal killers, deadly traps, and shocking betrayals. The movie combines slasher horror with psychological tension and explores how greed, bloodlines, and corruption can destroy ordinary people. The story begins with a group of college-aged friends traveling through the isolated forests of West Virginia. The main character is Danny, a quiet and somewhat confused young man who has recently learned that he inherited an old property called the Hobbs Springs Resort. The resort once served wealthy guests many decades earlier, but now it is abandoned and hidden deep within the mountains. Danny receives a mysterious letter informing him that the property legally belongs to him after the death of a distant relative. Curious about his family history and interested in possibly restoring the place, Danny decides to visit the resort with several close friends. Danny is joined by his girlfriend Tony and their friends Vic, Rod, Gillian, Brian, and Charlie. Each of them has a different personality, which helps create tension throughout the story. Some are skeptical about the trip, while others see it as an exciting adventure. At first, the journey seems normal, but the deeper they travel into the wilderness, the more unsettling things become. The roads are isolated, the locals act strangely, and there are hints that outsiders are not welcome in the area. As they approach the resort, the group realizes how remote the place truly is. Thick forests surround the old property, and there are almost no signs of civilization nearby. The building itself looks frozen in time. It appears old, damaged, and abandoned, yet strangely preserved. Despite its decaying appearance, there is something eerie about the place, as though someone has secretly been maintaining it. Soon after arriving, the group meets two strange caretakers named Jackson and Sally. They are an older man and woman who claim to have taken care of the resort for many years while waiting for Danny to arrive. Their behavior immediately feels suspicious. They speak politely, but there is a disturbing tone beneath their friendliness. They seem overly interested in Danny and strangely unconcerned about the presence of his friends. Sally especially behaves as though Danny's arrival fulfills some long-awaited prophecy. Danny learns that the resort belonged to his biological family, the Hillikers, a clan with dark secrets tied to the surrounding mountains. Jackson and Sally explain that Danny's relatives once owned the entire region and were highly respected. However, they avoid discussing the family's downfall in detail. Danny, who grew up without knowing much about his heritage, becomes increasingly fascinated by this hidden part of his identity. Meanwhile, the other friends grow uncomfortable. They notice strange noises at night, unsettling decorations in the resort, and evidence that someone else may be living nearby. The atmosphere becomes darker as the group realizes that they are isolated with no easy way to escape. Cell phones barely work, the roads are difficult to navigate, and the nearest town is far away. One of the movie's major themes is temptation. Danny begins to feel drawn toward the resort and the strange legacy connected to his bloodline. Jackson and Sally manipulate him by constantly reminding him that he belongs there. They treat him almost like royalty and encourage him to distance himself from his friends. Slowly, Danny starts acting differently. Instead of focusing on the concerns of his group, he becomes obsessed with learning about the family estate and the power that comes with it. The horror intensifies when members of the group begin disappearing one by one. Unknown to them, the mountains are inhabited by the deformed cannibal killers that define the Wrong Turn franchise. These mutants are descendants of inbred mountain families who survive by hunting and eating anyone who enters their territory. In previous films, the cannibals were mostly silent monsters, but in this installment, the story connects them more directly to Danny's family history. The first major attacks happen suddenly and brutally. The killers use traps, axes, knives, and torture devices to capture victims. The deaths are graphic and designed to shock viewers with gruesome violence. Unlike ordinary slashers where the killer quickly murders victims, Wrong Turn 6 often shows prolonged suffering, emphasizing the cruelty of the cannibals. One of Danny's friends wanders away from the group and is ambushed in the woods. The scene demonstrates how helpless outsiders are in this isolated environment. The killers know the terrain perfectly and move through the forest like predators. Their appearance is horrifying: scarred skin, distorted faces, and animal-like behavior caused by generations of inbreeding and violence. As more people disappear, panic spreads through the group. They begin suspecting Jackson and Sally are hiding something. The caretakers remain calm despite the chaos, which makes them even more suspicious. Eventually, it becomes clear that they are connected to the cannibal family and have been protecting them for years. Danny faces a growing internal conflict. Part of him wants to save his friends and escape, but another part becomes seduced by the idea of inheriting power and belonging to a family after spending his life feeling disconnected. Jackson and Sally exploit these emotional weaknesses. They tell Danny that the resort, land, and fortune can all be his if he accepts his true heritage. The movie slowly reveals that Danny is related to the cannibal clan through bloodlines hidden from him since childhood. His ancestors were involved in the same violent and corrupt traditions that produced the deformed killers living in the woods. Jackson and Sally believe Danny can restore the family legacy and reclaim control over the region. At the same time, Danny's girlfriend Toni desperately tries to keep him grounded. She notices how his personality changes and fears he is falling under the influence of the caretakers. Toni becomes one of the strongest voices of reason in the story. Unlike some horror characters who make foolish decisions, she constantly pushes for escape and warns the others not to trust anyone at the resort. The tension between Danny and his friends grows stronger after he hesitates to leave despite the danger. Instead of immediately running away after the attacks begin, Danny continues listening to Jackson and Sally. This frustrates the group and creates divisions among them. Some believe Danny is hiding information, while others think he has become mentally unstable. As night falls, the horror escalates dramatically. The cannibals launch more aggressive attacks on the remaining survivors. The forest becomes a deadly maze filled with traps and hidden dangers. Victims are hunted individually, often in extremely violent scenes involving dismemberment and torture. The movie uses darkness and isolation effectively. The woods feel endless and claustrophobic, trapping the characters both physically and psychologically. Every sound in the forest becomes threatening. Branches snapping, distant screams, and strange animal noises increase the paranoia of the survivors. Eventually, Danny uncovers the horrifying truth about his family. The Hillikers were not simply wealthy landowners. They were connected to generations of cannibalism, incest, and murder. The resort itself once served as a secret location where terrible acts occurred away from civilization. Jackson and Sally have spent years preserving this twisted legacy while waiting for the rightful heir to return. One of the most disturbing elements of the film is how Danny gradually accepts parts of this reality. Instead of completely rejecting his heritage, he becomes emotionally torn. The movie suggests that loneliness and the desire for belonging can make people vulnerable to manipulation. Danny spent much of his life without a strong sense of identity, and Jackson and Sally use that emptiness to pull him toward darkness. The surviving friends try repeatedly to escape, but every attempt ends in disaster. Vehicles are sabotaged, roads are blocked, and the cannibals constantly stalk them through the forest. The group realizes they are being hunted systematically. As the body count rises, the survivors discover hidden underground areas connected to the resort. These tunnels and chambers reveal evidence of years of torture and cannibalism. Bones, bloodstains, and old equipment show that countless victims died there long before the events of the movie. The resort is essentially a giant trap disguised as an inheritance. The film's climax centers on Danny's final choice between humanity and family loyalty. Jackson and Sally pressure him to embrace his bloodline fully and become leader of the cannibal clan. They argue that civilization rejected him, while the family accepts him completely. They present the violent mountain community as his true home. Toni refuses to give up on Danny and confronts him directly. She reminds him of the person he used to be and begs him not to surrender to the madness surrounding the resort. Their emotional conflict becomes the heart of the ending because Danny must decide whether he values love and morality more than power and belonging. The climax erupts into chaos as the surviving friends fight the cannibals in desperate attempts to stay alive. Weapons are improvised, brutal fights occur in the woods and inside the resort, and several characters meet horrifying deaths. The violence becomes increasingly intense as the story approaches its conclusion. Danny ultimately turns against Jackson and Sally after realizing the full extent of their manipulation. He understands that they never truly cared about him as a person. They only wanted a new leader to continue the family's horrifying traditions. However, by the time Danny recognizes the truth, much of the damage has already been done. The final confrontations are bloody and tragic. Characters who survived the earlier attacks are pushed to their physical and emotional limits. Trust collapses completely as everyone struggles to escape the nightmare alive. Like many films in the Wrong Turn series, the ending is dark rather than hopeful. Even when some characters survive, the trauma and destruction leave a sense of hopelessness. The movie suggests that evil tied to the mountains and the Hilliker bloodline cannot easily be destroyed. One reason Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort stands out from earlier entries is its greater focus on family legacy and psychological corruption rather than simple survival horror. Earlier films mainly centered on strangers trying to escape mutant cannibals, but this installment adds themes of inheritance, identity, and temptation. Danny's struggle gives the story a more personal dimension because the horror comes not only from external monsters but also from the darkness within his own ancestry. The film also differs because of its setting. The abandoned resort creates a gothic atmosphere compared to the usual cabins and forests seen in slasher movies. The old architecture, hidden tunnels, and isolated mountain environment make the location feel cursed. The resort itself almost becomes a character in the story, representing decay, secrecy, and generational evil. Visually, the movie emphasizes gore and brutality. Fans of extreme horror will recognize the franchise's signature style: graphic kills, disturbing makeup effects, and intense violence. The cannibals are portrayed as terrifying predators who enjoy hunting humans for sport and food. Their grotesque appearance reinforces the theme of degeneration caused by generations of isolation and inbreeding. At its core, however, the movie is also about manipulation. Jackson and Sally are not physically monstrous like the cannibals, yet they may be even more dangerous because they use psychological control. They carefully manipulate Danny's emotions, exploiting his insecurities and loneliness to guide him toward evil. This creates a more complex threat than simple physical violence. Danny's transformation throughout the story is tragic. He begins as an ordinary man curious about his heritage but slowly becomes consumed by the toxic legacy surrounding him. The movie explores how identity can influence behavior and how people searching for purpose can fall into destructive paths if they seek belonging in the wrong places. Toni represents the opposite force. She symbolizes morality, emotional connection, and resistance against corruption. Her determination to save Danny adds emotional weight to the story because she sees the good in him even as he begins changing. The film ultimately portrays the mountains as a place separated from normal civilization, almost like another world governed by savage rules. Once the characters enter this territory, ordinary law and safety disappear. Survival depends on instinct, courage, and the ability to resist psychological fear. Although Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort received mixed reactions from critics and audiences, it remains memorable for its dark atmosphere, violent horror sequences, and unusual focus on family inheritance within the franchise. Some viewers appreciated the attempt to deepen the mythology behind the cannibal family, while others felt the film relied too heavily on gore. Nevertheless, it continues the series' tradition of blending survival horror with shocking violence and isolated wilderness terror. By the end of the story, the audience is left with a grim understanding that some legacies are poisonous. Danny's inheritance was never truly a gift. It was a trap created by generations of violence and corruption. The resort, hidden in the mountains, symbolized the darkness of the past waiting to consume anyone connected to it. The film suggests that escaping such evil requires more than physical survival, it requires rejecting the temptation of power, identity, and belonging when they are built on cruelty and bloodshed. Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort is one of the darkest and most psychologically disturbing entries in the Wrong Turn franchise. Released in 2014 and directed by Valeri Milev, the film attempts to expand the mythology of the series by moving beyond simple survival horror and focusing on inheritance, bloodlines, manipulation, and corruption. While the earlier Wrong Turn films mostly centered on strangers being hunted through the wilderness by mutant cannibals, Wrong Turn 6 adds a deeper layer of mystery by tying the main character directly to the horrifying legacy of the cannibal family itself. The story revolves around Danny, a young man who unexpectedly learns that he has inherited an abandoned mountain resort called Hot Springs. Wanting to discover the truth about his family history, Danny travels to the isolated property with a group of close friends. What begins as a strange but exciting journey slowly becomes a nightmare filled with murder, betrayal, psychological manipulation, and terrifying cannibal killers hidden deep within the West Virginia mountains. The key point of the film lies in how Danny's inheritance becomes much more than a simple legal matter. The inheritance represents a dark family legacy waiting to reclaim him. The movie explores the idea that evil can survive through generations and that blood ties can become dangerous when connected to violence, corruption, and madness. At the beginning of the story, Danny appears to be an ordinary young man searching for identity and direction. He has little knowledge about his biological family and seems emotionally disconnected from his past. This makes him vulnerable from the very start. People who feel uncertain about who they are often become drawn toward anything that offers belonging or purpose, and this emotional weakness becomes the central reason why Jackson and Sally are able to manipulate him so effectively later in the film. Danny does not travel alone. His friends accompany him because the trip initially feels like an adventure. They expect to visit an old property, maybe restore it, and enjoy a few days away from normal life. The group includes Danny's girlfriend Toni and several other friends who each react differently to the strange environment surrounding Hot Springs. Some remain optimistic, while others quickly sense danger. The journey into the mountains immediately creates tension. The roads become isolated, civilization disappears, and the forest begins to feel threatening. This setting is important because the Wrong Turn franchise always uses isolation as a weapon. The deeper the characters move into the wilderness, the more powerless they become. There are no police nearby, no reliable communication, and no easy escape routes. The mountains seem cut off from the modern world, almost existing under their own savage rules. When the group finally arrives at Hot Springs, they encounter one of the film's most unsettling elements, the caretakers Jackson and Sally. At first glance, the pair appear polite and welcoming. They explain that they have maintained the resort while waiting for Danny to claim his inheritance. However, their behavior feels unnatural from the beginning. Their friendliness hides something deeply sinister. Jackson and Sally represent a different kind of horror than the cannibal killers. The cannibals are brutal physical monsters, but Jackson and Sally are psychological manipulators. They understand Danny's emotional vulnerabilities and carefully exploit them. Instead of threatening him directly, they tempt him with family history, wealth, power, and belonging. This psychological manipulation is one of the film's most important themes. Danny has spent much of his life disconnected from his roots, so when Jackson and Sally begin treating him as someone special, he becomes emotionally drawn toward them. They speak of his family as though it were noble and powerful. They tell him that Hot Springs belongs to him by blood and that he has a responsibility to reclaim his heritage. The resort itself plays a major symbolic role in the story. Hot Springs is not simply an abandoned building. It represents decay, secrecy, and hidden evil. Once it may have been luxurious, but now it stands rotting in the middle of the wilderness, disconnected from society. The building reflects the corrupted history of Danny's bloodline. Beneath its surface lies violence, death, and generations of horrifying traditions. As Danny explores the resort, he begins uncovering fragments of his family's past. Jackson and Sally slowly reveal that Danny belongs to the Hilliker family, the same bloodline connected to the deformed cannibals haunting the mountains. This revelation changes the story completely because Danny is no longer just another victim trying to survive. He is connected to the evil itself. The cannibals in the Wrong Turn series are products of generations of isolation, inbreeding, and brutality. They survive by hunting humans, setting traps, and consuming their victims. In earlier films, these killers were mostly presented as monstrous predators without much background. Wrong Turn 6 attempts to explain their origins more deeply by linking them to the Hilliker family legacy. This connection creates the film's central internal conflict. Danny is torn between two identities. One part of him wants to remain loyal to his friends and escape the nightmare surrounding Hot Springs. Another part becomes seduced by the idea of belonging to a powerful family with a hidden history. Jackson and Sally constantly encourage this darker side. The manipulation becomes stronger after the first violent attacks begin. Members of the group start disappearing or dying, yet Jackson and Sally remain calm. Their lack of fear reveals that they know exactly what is happening in the mountains. Eventually, it becomes clear that they have been protecting the cannibals for years. The film's horror intensifies because Danny hesitates to reject them immediately. Instead of instantly realizing the truth and escaping, he becomes psychologically trapped. The caretakers convince him that outsiders cannot understand his family legacy and that he belongs with them rather than with his friends. This is where the movie explores the dangerous power of identity and inheritance. People naturally want connection and purpose, but Wrong Turn 6 shows how those desires can become destructive when manipulated by evil influences. Danny's emotional need for belonging blinds him to the horrifying reality surrounding him. Meanwhile, Toni becomes one of the story's strongest moral forces. She notices the change happening inside Danny and desperately tries to bring him back to reality. Toni understands that Jackson and Sally are controlling him emotionally, and she repeatedly warns him not to trust them. Her role is important because she represents love, humanity, and morality against corruption and madness. As more friends die, the atmosphere becomes increasingly hopeless. The cannibals hunt the survivors through forests, underground passages, and hidden areas connected to the resort. The movie emphasizes brutality through graphic kill scenes, traps, and torture. The violence is extreme even by slasher standards, reinforcing the idea that the mountains operate under savage laws completely separate from civilization. The hidden tunnels beneath Hot Springs reveal even darker truths. Bones, bloodstains, and evidence of years of murder suggest that the resort has long served as a center for cannibalistic activity. Visitors who came to the mountains in the past likely disappeared without explanation, becoming victims of the family's horrifying traditions. The idea of hidden evil beneath a respectable surface is central to the movie. On the outside, Hot Springs appears to be a forgotten resort waiting for restoration. Beneath that appearance lies corruption and death. Similarly, Jackson and Sally appear polite and civilized, yet they are deeply involved in monstrous acts. Even Danny, who initially seems innocent, carries darkness within his bloodline. One of the film's strongest themes is the fear that evil can be inherited. Danny worries that his connection to the Hilliker family means he may eventually become like them. Jackson and Sally encourage this fear while also presenting it as destiny. They believe Danny should embrace the family's violent traditions rather than resist them. This creates a psychological horror element beyond simple survival. Danny is not only fighting external monsters but also battling the possibility that darkness exists within himself. The cannibals become symbols of what his bloodline has turned into after generations of isolation and brutality. The film also explores corruption through power. Jackson and Sally tempt Danny with promises of ownership, wealth, and authority. They speak of Hot Springs as though it is his kingdom waiting to be reclaimed. Their strategy is clever because they do not force him into evil through violence. Instead, they tempt him gradually, making him believe that accepting his family legacy will finally give his life meaning. This manipulation mirrors how real-world corruption often works. People rarely become corrupted instantly. Instead, they are slowly seduced through emotional weakness, ambition, loneliness, or the desire for acceptance. Danny's transformation throughout the movie reflects this process. As the surviving friends attempt escape, trust begins collapsing completely. Some characters blame Danny for leading them into danger, while others suspect he is hiding information. Fear and paranoia spread through the group, making survival even harder. The isolated setting strengthens this emotional breakdown. In normal society, people rely on laws, communication, and outside help for safety. In the mountains, none of those protections exist. The survivors are trapped inside an environment controlled by predators who know every path, tunnel, and hiding place. The cannibals themselves are terrifying because they represent the final result of generational corruption. They are no longer fully human in behavior or morality. Their appearance reflects physical decay caused by inbreeding, while their actions reflect total loss of humanity. Hunting and killing have become natural instincts for them. However, the movie suggests that the cannibals are not the only monsters. Jackson and Sally are arguably more frightening because they willingly preserve and support this evil. They maintain the resort, protect the killers, and manipulate Danny into continuing the cycle. Their evil is conscious and deliberate rather than animalistic. As the climax approaches, Danny finally realizes the full truth about his inheritance. Hot Springs was never meant to be a gift. It was a trap designed to draw him back into the family legacy. Jackson and Sally wanted him to become the new leader of the cannibal clan and continue the horrifying traditions of the Hilliker bloodline. This revelation forces Danny into his final moral choice. He must decide whether to embrace power and family loyalty or reject the corruption tied to his ancestry. Tony's influence becomes crucial during this moment because she reminds him that identity is defined by choices rather than blood alone. The climax erupts into violent confrontations between the survivors and the cannibals. The battles are brutal and desperate, emphasizing survival over heroism. Characters fight using whatever weapons they can find, and several deaths occur in graphic fashion. Eventually, Danny turns against Jackson and Sally after recognizing their manipulation. He understands that they never cared about him personally. To them, he was simply a tool needed to continue the family legacy. This realization is tragic because Danny's emotional vulnerability made him susceptible to corruption from the beginning. His search for belonging nearly destroyed both himself and the people he cared about. The ending of Wrong Turn 6 remains dark and unsettling, fitting the tone of the franchise. Even when evil is temporarily resisted, the damage left behind feels irreversible. Friends are dead, innocence is destroyed, and the horrifying legacy of the mountains continues to exist. The film also suggests that some forms of evil survive through secrecy and isolation. Hop Springs remained hidden for generations because the outside world never fully discovered what happened there. The mountains protected the cannibals by separating them from civilization. Although the movie received negative reactions from many critics and audiences, its central ideas remain interesting within the Wrong Turn series. Instead of focusing only on gore and survival, the film attempts to explore how identity, family history, and emotional vulnerability can pull people toward darkness. Danny's story ultimately becomes a tragedy about inheritance. He wanted answers about his past and hoped to find meaning in his family history. Instead, he discovered corruption, violence, and manipulation. The inheritance that seemed like an opportunity was actually a curse tied to generations of bloodshed. The film's deeper message is that not every legacy deserves preservation. Some traditions are poisonous and destructive, no matter how old or powerful they may seem. Danny's struggle represents the battle between accepting inherited evil or choosing a different path despite blood ties. In the end, Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort transforms the familiar cannibal horror formula into a story about corruption and identity. Beneath the gore and violence lies a disturbing exploration of how easily people searching for belonging can be manipulated by darkness. The mountains, the resort, and the cannibal family all symbolize hidden evil waiting to consume anyone vulnerable enough to embrace it. The opening section of Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort establishes the film's terrifying atmosphere by immediately showing that the mountains of West Virginia are controlled by brutal cannibal killers who prey upon anyone unfortunate enough to enter their territory. This key point is important because it introduces the central dangers of the story, reveals the twisted relationship between the cannibals and the caretakers Jackson and Sally, and slowly builds the psychological tension surrounding Danny's mysterious inheritance at Hop Springs. The events in this section also demonstrate one of the film's darkest themes, that beneath the appearance of hospitality and family lies manipulation, savagery, and death. The story begins deep within the isolated mountains, far away from normal civilization. The setting itself creates unease because the wilderness feels untouched, dangerous, and disconnected from the modern world. In horror films, isolated environments often symbolize vulnerability, and Wrong Turn 6 uses the forest and mountains to create the feeling that outsiders are entering a place where ordinary laws no longer apply. The film opens with two bikers enjoying what seems like a peaceful moment in a natural hot tub hidden within the mountains. Their scene is meant to create temporary calm before the horror begins. They are relaxed, carefree, and unaware that they are being watched. This contrast between pleasure and sudden violence is common in slasher films because it shocks the audience and immediately establishes danger. The bikers represent ordinary travelers who unknowingly wander into forbidden territory. To them, the mountains appear beautiful and exciting, but the audience soon learns that these woods belong to predators. The peaceful atmosphere quickly transforms into terror when the Hilliker brothers, Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye, attack them. These cannibal brothers are the central monsters of the Wrong Turn franchise. Their appearance is horrifying because generations of inbreeding and isolation have physically and mentally transformed them into savage killers. They are no longer portrayed as normal humans with moral understanding. Instead, they function almost like wild predators hunting prey in their natural environment. The murders of the bikers serve several purposes in the story. First, they establish the brutality of the cannibals. The killings are sudden, violent, and merciless, showing that nobody entering the mountains is safe. Second, the scene reinforces the idea that the cannibals have complete control over the wilderness. They move through the forest silently and strike without warning, demonstrating that they know the terrain far better than outsiders ever could. The scene also introduces the audience to the film's grim tone. Unlike traditional thrillers where victims may have a chance to fight back, Wrong Turn 6 emphasizes helplessness. Once someone becomes a target in these mountains, survival becomes extremely unlikely. After the opening murders, the story shifts toward Hobbs Springs, the mysterious resort hidden deep within the wilderness. This transition is important because the resort becomes the central symbol of the film's hidden corruption. At first glance, Hobbs Springs appears abandoned and forgotten, but beneath its aging walls lies a horrifying secret connected to the cannibal family. The caretakers of the resort, Jackson and Sally, are introduced as strange and unsettling figures. They appear elderly, polite, and welcoming on the surface, but there is something deeply unnatural about them. Their calm behavior contrasts sharply with the brutal violence occurring in the mountains. What makes Jackson and Sally especially disturbing is that they are not physically monstrous like the cannibal brothers. Instead, their evil comes from manipulation and psychological corruption. They knowingly protect the cannibals and help maintain the horrifying system operating around Hobbs Springs. While the cannibal brothers kill through instinct and savagery, Jackson and Sally operate with intelligence and calculation. The film soon reveals that Danny has arrived at Hobbs Springs to claim an inheritance. This is one of the story's most important plot points because the inheritance is not simply about property or wealth. It represents a dark family legacy waiting to reclaim him. Danny arrives with a group of friends and loved ones, including his girlfriend Tony, her brother Rod, and their friends Vic, Charlie, Brian, and Gillian. Their presence initially creates a more relaxed atmosphere because they behave like ordinary young adults on a road trip adventure. Some joke with each other, some are curious about the resort, and others are simply interested in having fun. However, beneath this casual atmosphere lies growing tension. The audience already knows the mountains are filled with killers, creating dramatic irony. The characters believe they are entering an unusual but harmless place, while viewers understand they are walking directly into danger. Danny himself is emotionally vulnerable from the beginning. He knows little about his family history and seems curious about discovering where he came from. This emotional uncertainty becomes the reason Jackson and Sally are able to influence him later in the story. Jackson and Sally immediately begin treating Danny differently from the others. They speak to him with warmth and familiarity, almost as though they have been waiting for him to arrive for years. This creates subtle psychological pressure. Danny begins feeling special, connected, and important in a way he may never have experienced before. The other friends notice strange details around the resort. The environment feels eerie, the caretakers behave oddly, and the isolation becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Still, they try to remain optimistic because leaving immediately would mean abandoning Danny's inheritance opportunity. One of the film's most disturbing early scenes involves Agnes Fields, an elderly guest staying at the resort. Agnes represents vulnerability and innocence. She is not involved in conflict or danger, making her death especially shocking. When Agnes is suddenly struck by an axe and pinned against the wall, the movie reveals the true horror hidden inside Hobbs Springs. Her murder is brutal and sudden, emphasizing how unpredictable death is within this environment. The violence is not just physical but symbolic. The resort, which should represent comfort and hospitality, instead becomes a place of slaughter. Jackson personally killing Agnes afterward reveals his direct involvement in the evil surrounding the resort. Until this point, viewers may suspect he knows more than he admits, but Agnes's death confirms that he is an active participant in the murders. This moment is crucial because it destroys the illusion that Jackson and Sally are simply eccentric caretakers trapped in unfortunate circumstances. They are willing accomplices who preserve and support the cannibal family's horrifying lifestyle. The next major development occurs when Brian and Gillian go shopping for groceries in town. Their trip outside the resort briefly reconnects the story with civilization, but even the nearby town feels tense and fearful. Sheriff Doucette becomes an important figure during this section because he represents law, order, and outside authority. He informs Brian and Gillian about the disappearances of townsfolk and hotel guests, including Agnes. His concern suggests that people in the region are aware something terrible exists in the mountains, even if they do not fully understand it. The sheriff's warnings increase the tension dramatically. For the first time, the group realizes the disappearances may not be isolated incidents. A pattern of violence exists around Hobbs Springs. However, the sheriff himself quickly becomes a victim. As he drives away, he encounters a roadblock and is murdered by Three Finger. This scene is significant because it symbolically destroys the last connection to safety and authority. In many horror films, police officers represent hope that the outside world can intervene and restore order. By killing Sheriff Doucette, the movie shows that normal authority has no power in these mountains. The cannibals dominate the territory completely. Three Fingers' attack also reinforces the idea that escape is becoming impossible. Roads are blocked, communication is limited, and anyone attempting to investigate the disappearances risks death. When Brian and Gillian return with news about the missing townsfolk and the sheriff's concerns, suspicion within the group begins growing rapidly. Danny's friends become increasingly uncomfortable with Jackson and Sally, especially because Danny himself seems oddly attached to staying with his newfound family. This creates emotional conflict inside the group. Some believe they should leave immediately, while Danny continues feeling drawn toward the resort and his family history. His hesitation frustrates the others because they sense danger even if they do not yet understand its full extent. The deterioration of Danny's relationships is one of the most important psychological aspects of the story. Jackson and Sally slowly isolate him emotionally from his friends. They encourage him to focus on family, inheritance, and belonging rather than on the fears of outsiders. Tony especially notices the changes happening in Danny. She sees that he is becoming fascinated with Hobbs Springs and less willing to listen to reason. Her concern reflects the film's deeper theme about manipulation and identity. Danny's search for belonging makes him vulnerable to corruption. Tony sends Vic into the woods to find Danny after he disappears hunting with Jackson. This decision leads to another disturbing discovery. Vic witnesses Sawtooth devouring a deer killed by Danny. This scene is symbolic because it shows Danny indirectly participating in the cannibal's world. Although Danny himself does not eat the deer, the fact that his hunt provides food for Sawtooth creates a connection between him and the savage mountain lifestyle. The image of Sawtooth consuming raw flesh reinforces the animalistic nature of the cannibals. They are portrayed as creatures driven by hunger and violence rather than humanity. Despite all the warning signs, Danny continues talking about renovating Hobbs Springs and reopening the resort in the future. This idea reveals how deeply Jackson and Sally's influence has affected him. Instead of recognizing the place as cursed and dangerous, he begins imagining it as his future home and source of purpose. His friends reluctantly agree to stay, partly because they do not want to abandon him and partly because they still do not fully understand the horror surrounding them. However, Brian and Gillian secretly plan to leave and steal valuable items from the resort for money. Their decision reflects another theme in the film: greed and selfishness often lead characters toward destruction. Instead of simply escaping, Brian and Gillian become distracted by material gain. While searching the resort, they discover a hidden basement leading to an underground bathhouse. This hidden area symbolizes the secret corruption buried beneath the surface of Hobbs Springs. Above ground, the resort appears old but relatively ordinary. Underground lies darkness, secrecy, and violence. Gillian seduces Brian in the bathhouse, creating another temporary moment of intimacy before horror interrupts. The film frequently contrasts pleasure and violence to increase shock value. Just as the bikers were attacked during a romantic moment earlier, Brian and Gillian become vulnerable while distracted by desire. The cannibals suddenly attack them with horrifying brutality. Brian suffers a crippling brain injury after being struck in the head, leaving him helpless. Gillian is then violently dismembered. This sequence demonstrates the helplessness of the victims against the cannibals. Once attacked, survival becomes almost impossible. The violence is graphic and cruel, emphasizing the savage nature of the killers. Sally's decision to spare Brian initially seemed strange, but it quickly reveals her own disturbing psychology. Instead of showing mercy, she drags the injured Brian to her room and sexually assaults him. This scene is one of the film's darkest moments because it combines physical vulnerability with psychological horror. Brian is unable to defend himself due to his injury, making Sally's actions even more disturbing. Jackson later orders Sally to kill Brian, and she suffocates him with a pillow. This murder reinforces the absolute cruelty operating within Hobbs Springs. Human life means nothing to Jackson, Sally, or the cannibal family. The entire sequence highlights the film's central themes: isolation, corruption, manipulation, and inherited evil. Danny and his friends entered the mountains expecting answers and adventure, but instead they discovered a hidden world ruled by cannibalistic violence and psychological madness. The horror of Wrong Turn 6 does not come only from the cannibals themselves. It comes from the realization that evil has been preserved and protected for generations through family loyalty, secrecy, and manipulation. Hobbs Springs appears to be a forgotten resort, but in reality it is a trap designed to maintain the horrifying legacy of the Hilliker family. This section of Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort, represents the darkest and most important turning point in the entire movie because it completes Danny's transformation from an ordinary outsider into a participant in the horrifying Hilliker family legacy. The events in this part of the story are not only about violence and survival but also about corruption, manipulation, identity, and the destruction of morality. The film shifts from simple slasher horror into psychological tragedy as Danny gradually abandons his friends and embraces the savage world hidden within the mountains. The key point begins during a heated argument between Danny and Tony. By this stage of the story, tension has been growing steadily between Danny and the rest of the group. His friends have become increasingly suspicious of Jackson and Sally, especially after several disappearances and strange events around Hobbs Springs. Tony, more than anyone else, notices how much Danny has changed since arriving at the resort. At the beginning of the film, Danny seemed like a normal young man searching for answers about his family history. However, as Jackson and Sally continue manipulating him emotionally, he becomes more distant from his friends and more fascinated by his inheritance. This emotional shift creates the foundation for the argument with Tony. The argument itself is important because it symbolizes Danny standing between two worlds. On one side are Tony and his friends, representing humanity, morality, and his former life. On the other side are Jackson, Sally, and the Hilliker family, representing corruption, violence, and the dark legacy hidden in the mountains. Tony desperately tries to convince Danny that something is terribly wrong. She sees the danger surrounding Hobbs Springs and understands that Jackson and Sally are manipulating him. However, Danny is no longer thinking rationally. His emotional need for belonging has become stronger than his trust in his friends. This moment reflects one of the film's deepest themes: people searching for identity can become vulnerable to manipulation. Danny spent much of his life disconnected from his family roots, and Jackson and Sally exploit that loneliness perfectly. They make him feel important, accepted, and chosen. After the argument, Jackson and Sally take Danny to a clearing in the woods where he is finally introduced to his long-lost cannibal relatives. This scene is one of the most symbolic moments in the film because it functions almost like a dark initiation ceremony. The clearing itself feels primitive and ritualistic, far removed from normal civilization. Surrounded by the wilderness, Danny comes face to face with the terrifying truth about his bloodline. The cannibal clan gathers around him not as enemies but as family. This changes the meaning of the horror entirely. Earlier in the movie, the cannibals were simply predators hunting outsiders. Now the story reveals that Danny is connected to them by blood. He is not just trapped in their territory, he belongs to them. Jackson and Sally explain the origins of the Hilliker family to Danny. They describe a bloodline shaped by isolation, violence, and survival in the mountains. Generations of inbreeding and cannibalism transformed the family into savage killers, but Jackson and Sally speak of this history almost proudly, as though it were a sacred tradition rather than a curse. This conversation is psychologically powerful because Jackson and Sally frame the family's brutality as destiny. They encourage Danny to believe that his true identity lies with the Hillikers rather than with the civilized world. The film uses this moment to explore the fear of inherited evil. Danny begins questioning whether darkness exists naturally within him because of his bloodline. Jackson and Sally manipulate this fear by suggesting that he cannot escape who he truly is. Meanwhile, Vic secretly follows them into the woods and overhears the conversation. Vic represents the last attempt to uncover the truth before it completely consumes Danny. Unlike Danny, Vic immediately understands the horror of what he has discovered. However, the mountains belong to the Hillikers, and outsiders cannot move through them unnoticed. Vic is captured by the cannibal clan, leading to one of the film's most disturbing scenes. The murder of Vic is not portrayed as a random killing. Instead, it becomes part of a ritualistic ceremony for the family. His throat is cut, and his body is violently disemboweled before the clan consumes his remains together. This horrifying sequence serves several symbolic purposes. First, it demonstrates the total savagery of the Hillikers. They are no longer functioning as ordinary human beings with morality or empathy. Cannibalism has become part of their culture and identity. Second, the ceremony acts as Danny's initiation into the family. Jackson and Sally want him to witness the ritual because they hope it will sever his emotional ties to civilization and normalize the violence surrounding him. The communal nature of the ceremony is especially disturbing. The clan eats together almost like a family meal, suggesting that murder and cannibalism are central parts of their social structure. This transforms the horror from isolated violence into an entire culture built upon brutality. Danny's reaction during this sequence is critical to understanding his transformation. Earlier in the movie, such violence would likely have horrified him completely. Now, although he may still feel conflicted, he does not reject the family outright. His hesitation shows how deeply Jackson and Sally's manipulation has affected him. The next morning, the surviving members of Danny's group decide they must finally leave. By this stage, fear and suspicion have reached unbearable levels. Tony, Rod, and Charlie realize that staying at Hobbs Springs means certain death. However, their discovery in the kitchen confirms the full horror hidden inside the resort. They find Jackson preparing meals using the dismembered remains of previous victims, including Brian and Jillian. This scene completely destroys any illusion of civilization surrounding Hobbs Springs. Kitchens are normally associated with warmth, nourishment, and family gatherings. Here, the kitchen becomes a place of grotesque horror where human bodies are treated as food. Jackson's calm behavior while cooking human remains makes the moment even more disturbing. He acts as though this is perfectly normal, revealing how deeply corrupted the family has become. For Tony, Rod, and Charlie, this discovery confirms that everyone who disappeared at the resort became victims of cannibalism. The realization transforms their fear into desperation. They attempt to escape immediately, but the mountains are already under the control of the cannibal clan. The survivors run directly into the Hillikers, leading to another brutal attack. Charlie and Rod are both killed during the confrontation. Their deaths emphasize one of the movie's central ideas: outsiders rarely survive once the family decides to hunt them. Rod's death is particularly tragic because he had tried to protect Tony throughout the story. His murder symbolizes the collapse of safety and loyalty among the group. One by one, Danny's former friends are erased by the family he is slowly embracing. At this point, Tony becomes the story's final moral force. Unlike the others, she refuses to give up either physically or emotionally. She still believes Danny can be saved from the corruption surrounding him. Tony arms herself with a rifle from the resort's armory, marking a major shift in her character. Earlier in the story, she mainly tried to reason with Danny emotionally. Now she understands that survival requires direct confrontation. Her decision to enter the underground bathhouse and confront Sally is extremely significant. The bathhouse itself symbolizes hidden corruption beneath the surface of Hobbs Springs. Earlier in the movie, Brian and Jillian discovered it before being attacked. Now Tony enters it willingly, descending directly into the heart of the family's darkness. The confrontation between Tony and Sally is both physical and symbolic. Sally represents manipulation, corruption, and twisted family loyalty. Tony represents morality, humanity, and resistance against evil. During their violent fight, Tony manages to disfigure Sally and shoot off her leg with the rifle. This moment is important because it briefly shows that the seemingly unstoppable family can be wounded and challenged. Sally's disfigurement also carries symbolic meaning. Throughout the movie, she maintained the appearance of an eccentric but composed caretaker. Tony's attack physically exposes the ugliness hidden beneath that facade. Jackson becomes enraged by Tony's resistance and orders Danny to kill her. This is the ultimate test of Danny's loyalty. Jackson wants Danny to prove that he fully belongs to the Hilliker family by murdering the woman who loves him. However, Danny hesitates and allows Tony to escape instead. This hesitation reveals that some part of his humanity still survives despite the manipulation. For a brief moment, it seems possible that Danny might reject the family completely. But the tragedy of the story lies in how close he has already moved toward darkness. Jackson chases Tony through the resort, determined to eliminate the final outsider threatening the family. The pursuit creates intense suspense because Tony is now completely alone. In a desperate act of survival, Tony retaliates by stabbing Jackson in the head with a set of keys, killing him. Jackson's death is one of the most satisfying moments in the movie because he was the mastermind behind much of the manipulation and horror surrounding Hobbs Springs. His relationship with Danny drives much of the psychological tension in the story because he constantly pressures him to reject morality and embrace his heritage. Aqueela Zoll plays Tony, Danny's girlfriend, and the film's strongest moral center. Tony is one of the few characters who immediately senses that something is deeply wrong at Hobbs Springs. Unlike Danny, she does not become seduced by the idea of family inheritance or belonging. Aqueela Zoll portrays Tony as intelligent, emotionally strong, and determined. Throughout the movie, Tony repeatedly tries to protect Danny from Jackson and Sally's influence. She notices the changes in his behavior and understands that the resort is corrupting him psychologically. Tony's importance grows as the story progresses because she represents humanity and resistance against evil. While other characters panic or become distracted, Tony focuses on survival and on saving Danny from himself. Her emotional connection to Danny gives the story tragic depth because she continues believing in his goodness even after he begins turning against his friends. The confrontation between Tony and Sally later in the film becomes symbolic because Tony is fighting not only for survival but also against the corruption consuming Danny. Aqueela Zoll's performance gives the character emotional intensity, especially during the final sections where Tony desperately tries to escape the nightmare surrounding Hobbs Springs. Sadie Katz plays Sally, one of the most disturbing figures in the movie. Sally initially appears strange but somewhat harmless, acting as Jackson's partner in maintaining the resort. However, as the story unfolds, Sally reveals herself to be deeply unstable, manipulative, and violently loyal to the Hilliker family traditions. Sadie Katz portrays Sally with unpredictable energy. Unlike Jackson's calm and calculated evil, Sally feels emotionally chaotic and unsettling. Her behavior constantly shifts between friendliness, seduction, aggression, and madness. Sally's role is especially important because she helps psychologically manipulate Danny into accepting the family legacy. She treats him almost like royalty, encouraging him to see himself as the rightful heir to Hobbs Springs. One of the darkest aspects of Sally's character is how she represents twisted intimacy and corrupted family loyalty. Her actions throughout the movie are both violent and psychologically disturbing. Sadie Katz gives the character an eerie unpredictability that makes viewers uncomfortable whenever she appears on screen. Sally also symbolizes the decay hidden beneath the surface of Hobbs Springs. While the resort itself appears abandoned but functional, Sally's behavior reveals the madness buried inside the family structure. Rollo Skinner plays Vic, one of Danny's friends and one of the more skeptical members of the group. Vic becomes suspicious of Jackson and Sally earlier than some of the others. He represents caution and survival instinct within the group. Rollo Skinner portrays Vic as practical and observant. Unlike Danny, Vic does not become emotionally attached to the resort or the family history surrounding it. Instead, he recognizes danger and attempts to uncover the truth. Vic's decision to secretly follow Danny and observe the cannibal clan demonstrates courage but also curiosity. Unfortunately, his discovery leads to one of the film's most brutal deaths. His murder becomes part of the cannibal family's horrifying ceremony. Vic's death is significant because it marks the point where the family fully reveals its savage traditions. Rollo Skinner's performance helps establish Vic as a character who understands the danger too late to escape it. Billy Ashworth plays Rod, Tony's brother. Rod functions as a protective figure throughout much of the movie. He cares deeply about Tony's safety and becomes increasingly frustrated with Danny as Danny falls deeper under Jackson and Sally's influence. Billy Ashworth portrays Rod as loyal and aggressive when necessary. He is one of the characters most willing to confront danger directly. Unlike Danny, Rod refuses to trust the strange caretakers or believe the resort is safe. Rod's growing anger reflects the audience's frustration with Danny's behavior. While Danny becomes more attached to the Hilliker family, Rod sees the obvious danger surrounding them. Rod's eventual death during the survivors' escape attempt emphasizes the hopelessness of fighting against the cannibal clan within their own territory. Even strong and determined characters are ultimately overwhelmed by the violence surrounding Hobbs Springs. Harry Belcher plays Charlie, another member of Danny's group. Charlie represents the ordinary outsider trapped in a nightmare he does not fully understand. Throughout the film, Charlie reacts with increasing fear and confusion as strange events unfold around the resort. Harry Belcher portrays Charlie as someone trying to remain calm while gradually realizing the terrifying truth. Charlie's role becomes important during the later stages of the film when the surviving friends finally attempt escape. His death reinforces the film's dark message that outsiders rarely survive once the Hillikers begin hunting them. Joe Gamanara plays Brian, one of the more carefree members of the group. Brian initially appears relaxed and focused more on enjoying the trip than worrying about danger. However, Brian's storyline becomes increasingly tragic. Alongside Gillian, he discovers hidden areas beneath the resort that reveal the darkness lurking underneath Hobbs Springs. Joe Gamanara portrays Brian as someone caught completely off guard by the violence surrounding him. His brutal injury and eventual death represent the helplessness of ordinary people against the cannibal family. Brian's suffering also highlights the cruelty of Sally and Jackson. Even after Brian becomes physically vulnerable, they continue treating him as disposable rather than human. Roxanne Paulette plays Gillian, Brian's girlfriend. Gillian initially appears confident and playful, helping create a temporary sense of normality within the group. Roxanne Paulette's performance becomes important during the bathhouse sequence, where Gillian and Brian unknowingly descend into the hidden heart of the resort's corruption. Gillian's brutal death is one of the film's most shocking moments because it occurs immediately after an intimate and vulnerable scene. Her murder demonstrates how quickly pleasure and safety can turn into horror within the world of Wrong Turn 6. The film uses Gillian's death to reinforce the idea that Hobbs Springs itself is a trap. Beneath the surface of the abandoned resort lies violence, cannibalism, and hidden evil. Radoslav Parvanov portrays Three Finger, the most recognizable cannibal killer in the Wrong Turn franchise. Three Finger functions almost like the face of the mutant family throughout the series. Unlike many human villains, Three Finger communicates mostly through violence and physical presence. Radoslav Parvanov portrays him as animalistic, relentless, and terrifying. Three Finger represents the savage instincts of the Hilliker bloodline. He hunts outsiders without hesitation and serves as one of the clan's primary killers. His final act of murdering Tony symbolizes Danny's complete surrender to the family legacy because Danny allows the killing to happen instead of protecting her. Danko Jordanov plays Sawtooth, another member of the cannibal family. Sawtooth's appearance and behavior emphasize the grotesque effects of generations of inbreeding and isolation. Sawtooth is portrayed as savage and predatory, often shown consuming raw flesh or attacking victims with brutal force. Danko Jordanov's physical performance helps create the horrifying image of a creature barely connected to humanity. Asen Asenov plays One Eye, the third cannibal brother. Like the others, One Eye represents the monstrous result of the Hilliker family's violent history. Although these cannibal characters speak little, their physical presence dominates the film's horror atmosphere. They function as living symbols of inherited corruption and degeneration. Kicker Robinson plays Sheriff Doucette, one of the few representatives of law and civilization in the story. The sheriff suspects something terrible is happening around Hobbs Springs and warns Brian and Gillian about the disappearances in town. Sheriff Doucette's murder is important because it removes the possibility of outside rescue or authority. Once he dies, the characters become completely isolated. Talitha Luke Erdley plays Doria, while Luke Cousins portrays Nick. Though smaller characters, they help establish the broader atmosphere of the resort and surrounding town. Josie Kidd plays Agnes Fields, an elderly guest at Hobbs Springs whose violent death early in the movie reveals the horrifying truth hidden inside the resort. Agnes represents innocence and vulnerability. Her murder destroys the illusion that the resort is simply strange or mysterious. Instead, it becomes clear that Hobbs Springs is a place of death. Vanetka Georgieva appears as the overweight woman, adding to the unsettling environment surrounding the resort and the hidden cannibal community. Together, the cast of Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort creates a world filled with paranoia, violence, and psychological decay. Each actor contributes to the film's exploration of family corruption and inherited evil. The human characters are not simply victims being hunted by monsters. Instead, they represent different reactions to fear, temptation, survival, and manipulation. Danny seeks belonging, Tony fights for morality, Jackson and Sally preserve corruption, and the cannibal brothers embody the savage consequences of generations of violence. The cast helps transform the movie from a simple slasher film into a tragic story about identity and corruption. By the end, the audience sees how completely the Hilliker family legacy destroys relationships, morality, and humanity itself. The production and release of Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort represent an important chapter in the evolution of the Wrong Turn franchise because the film attempted to reshape the direction of the series while maintaining the brutal horror elements that fans associated with the earlier movies. Although the movie was released directly to home media in 2014, its development involved major creative changes, a new director, a different visual style, and an effort to expand the mythology of the cannibal family beyond simple survival horror. Understanding the production and release of the film helps explain why Wrong Turn 6 feels different from previous installments and why it became one of the more controversial entries in the franchise. The Wrong Turn series began as a backwoods survival horror franchise centered on travelers who become trapped in isolated wilderness areas and hunted by deformed cannibal killers. Over time, the series developed a recognizable formula involving graphic violence, isolated locations, and mutant mountain families created through generations of inbreeding and brutality. By the time the sixth film entered development, the franchise already had an established fan base expecting gore, suspense, and shocking death scenes. However, the producers also faced a challenge. After several sequels, the series risked becoming repetitive. Many slasher franchises eventually struggle with finding new ways to tell similar stories without losing the elements audiences expect. Wrong Turn 6 attempted to solve this problem by shifting focus toward family inheritance, psychological manipulation, and the origins of the cannibal bloodline. One of the most important production changes involved the replacement of director Declan O'Brien. O'Brien had directed the previous installments in the franchise and helped shape the tone of the later Wrong Turn films. His movies focused heavily on brutal violence, dark humor, and non-stop survival horror. Under his direction, the franchise embraced increasingly graphic gore and exaggerated slasher elements. When Valeri Milev replaced O'Brien as director for Wrong Turn 6, the series experienced a noticeable creative shift. A new director often changes the visual style, pacing, and atmosphere of a film series because each filmmaker brings different artistic instincts and storytelling priorities. Valeri Milev approached Wrong Turn 6 with a stronger emphasis on psychological horror and twisted family dynamics. While the film still contains extreme violence and graphic death scenes, it spends more time exploring Danny's emotional transformation and the manipulative influence of Jackson and Sally. This creative decision changed the structure of the story. Earlier Wrong Turn films mainly focused on victims trying to escape from cannibal killers. In Wrong Turn 6, the horror also comes from watching Danny slowly embrace the darkness surrounding his family legacy. The film becomes less about random strangers being hunted and more about corruption, inheritance, and identity. The change in direction is visible throughout the movie's atmosphere. Earlier entries often emphasized fast-paced survival and chase sequences. Wrong Turn 6 still includes violent attacks, but it also slows down to create tension through mystery and psychological manipulation. The abandoned resort of Hobbs Springs feels eerie and decayed, almost like a haunted relic from another era. The decision to focus on family history gave the movie a more gothic tone compared to earlier installments. The isolated resort hidden in the mountains resembles a cursed estate filled with secrets rather than simply another dangerous wilderness setting. Originally, the sixth installment was intended to continue the storyline established in Wrong Turn 5, Bloodlines. The earlier films in the series had gradually created what many viewers considered a prequel trilogy, exploring the background of the cannibal family and the town connected to them. The initial idea behind Wrong Turn 6 was reportedly to complete this storyline directly. However, the concept was eventually changed or scrapped, leading to a partially rebooted direction for the franchise. This explains why Wrong Turn 6 feels different from its predecessors. Instead of functioning purely as another continuation, the movie introduces new mythology surrounding the Hilliker family and Danny's inheritance. The story attempts to expand the franchise by suggesting that the cannibal clan operates almost like a hidden dynasty with traditions and bloodlines stretching back generations. This shift toward family legacy changes the meaning of the cannibals themselves. In earlier films, they were mostly portrayed as monstrous killers lurking in the woods. In Wrong Turn 6, the film suggests a broader social structure surrounding them. Jackson and Sally act as caretakers and protectors of the clan, while Danny becomes positioned as the future leader of the family. This deeper mythology was an ambitious attempt to add complexity to the franchise. Instead of focusing solely on physical horror, the movie explores themes of belonging, inherited evil, and psychological corruption. Production for the film reportedly began in March 2014 in Bulgaria. The choice of Bulgaria as the filming location was important for several reasons. Many horror films and lower-budget productions shoot in Eastern Europe because production costs are lower while still providing access to forests, mountains, abandoned buildings, and skilled film crews. Bulgaria's landscapes worked especially well for Wrong Turn 6 because the country contains dense forests, isolated rural areas, and old architecture capable of creating the eerie atmosphere needed for Hobbs Springs. Even though the movie is set in West Virginia, the Bulgarian wilderness successfully creates the illusion of remote American mountains. The forests appear dark, endless, and disconnected from civilization, which strengthens the movie's feeling of isolation. The filming locations also contribute heavily to the psychological atmosphere of the story. Hobbs Springs itself becomes almost like a character within the movie. The decaying resort, underground bathhouse, hidden tunnels, and remote mountain surroundings all create a sense of forgotten history and buried corruption. The production design reflects the themes of decay and hidden evil. Although the resort once may have been elegant, it now feels abandoned and haunted by violence. The faded interiors, dim lighting, and aging architecture symbolize the corruption of the Hilliker family legacy. Filming in Bulgaria also allowed the production team to create large outdoor scenes involving forests and mountain trails without requiring expensive Hollywood budgets. The natural environment becomes essential to the movie's horror because the wilderness traps the characters physically and psychologically. The isolation of the setting reinforces one of the franchise's central themes: once outsiders enter the territory controlled by the cannibals, escape becomes nearly impossible. Another important production aspect was the makeup and practical effects used to create the Cannibal Brothers' three-finger, saw-tooth, and one eye. The Wrong Turn franchise became known for its grotesque mutant villains, and Wrong Turn 6 continued this tradition. The filmmakers relied heavily on makeup effects to transform actors into horrifying creatures shaped by generations of inbreeding and violence. Their scarred skin, distorted features, and animalistic appearance are crucial to the visual identity of the series. Unlike some horror films that rely primarily on computer-generated imagery, the Wrong Turn franchise generally emphasized practical makeup effects. This gives the cannibals a more physical and disturbing presence on screen. The gore effects were also a major part of production. The franchise had built a reputation for graphic violence, and Wrong Turn 6 attempted to satisfy horror fans expecting brutal kill scenes. The film includes dismemberment, mutilation, cannibalistic rituals, and violent attacks designed to shock audiences. However, the filmmakers also tried to combine these extreme horror elements with psychological tension. The violence is not only meant to disgust viewers but also to reinforce the film's themes about corruption and savagery. The casting choices further supported this darker tone. Anthony Illott's portrayal of Danny focused on emotional vulnerability rather than traditional heroism. Chris Jarvis and Sadie Katz brought unsettling psychological depth to Jackson and Sally, making them more disturbing because of their manipulative intelligence. The performances helped distinguish Wrong Turn 6 from earlier entries by emphasizing emotional corruption alongside physical horror. When the movie moved toward release, the producers chose to distribute it primarily through home media rather than a major theatrical release. Fox Home Entertainment released the film on DVD and Blu-ray on October 21, 2014. This release strategy was common for later installments in long-running horror franchises. Direct-to-video horror movies often target dedicated fans who already follow the series rather than aiming for large mainstream theatrical audiences. Releasing the film directly to home media also reduced financial risk. The producers did not need to compete with major theatrical releases or spend enormous amounts on marketing campaigns. Despite receiving mostly negative reactions from critics and many viewers, the movie still generated over $1 million in combined DVD and Blu-ray sales in North America. This demonstrates that the franchise retained enough popularity among horror fans to remain commercially viable even without theatrical success. The critical response to Wrong Turn 6 was harsh for several reasons. Many critics felt the movie relied too heavily on graphic violence and exploitation. Others believed the story's darker sexual and psychological elements crossed uncomfortable lines. Some viewers also disliked the shift toward family mythology and Danny's transformation into part of the cannibal clan. Fans expecting a straightforward survival slasher sometimes found the psychological themes strange or excessive. However, other horror fans appreciated the attempt to deepen the franchise mythology. Instead of repeating the exact same formula, Wrong Turn 6 tried to explore how the cannibal family preserved its traditions and manipulated new generations into continuing them. The movie's ending especially divided audiences. Danny becoming the new leader of the Hilliker family created a tragic conclusion rather than a heroic survival story. Instead of defeating evil, the protagonist ultimately joins it. This ending reflects the production team's effort to create a darker and more psychologically disturbing narrative. The film suggests that evil survives not only through violence but also through inheritance, manipulation, and emotional vulnerability. The release of Wrong Turn 6 also marked an important transition point for the franchise overall. After the movie, the series eventually moved in a different direction with Wrong Turn 2021, which reimagined the concept almost entirely. The 2021 film abandoned much of the original cannibal mythology and instead introduced a new isolated community with different motivations and themes. This change showed that the producers recognized the need to reinvent the franchise again after the increasingly extreme direction of the later sequels. In retrospect, Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort represents both an attempt to expand the mythology of the series and a reflection of direct-to-video horror filmmaking during the 2010s. The production combined limited-budget filmmaking techniques with ambitious thematic ideas about inheritance, identity, and corruption. While the movie retained the gore and brutality fans expected, it also experimented with psychological horror and tragic character transformation. The Bulgarian filming locations, gothic atmosphere, practical makeup effects, and focus on family manipulation helped give the film a unique identity within the franchise. Although critics largely rejected the movie, its production history reveals filmmakers trying to push the Wrong Turn series beyond repetitive survival horror. The story of Danny inheriting Hob Springs and becoming consumed by the Hilliker family legacy transformed the film into more than just another slasher sequel. The production choices ultimately shaped a movie that feels darker, stranger, and more psychologically disturbing than many earlier entries in the franchise. Even with its flaws and controversy, Wrong Turn 6 remains a memorable chapter because it attempted to explore how horror can grow not only from monsters in the woods but also from the dangerous desire for belonging, identity, and family acceptance. The critical response to Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort reveals an important and complicated chapter in the history of the Wrong Turn franchise. By the time the sixth installment was released in 2014, the series had already survived for more than a decade, transforming from a single backwoods horror film into one of the longest-running modern slasher franchises. The reactions from critics and horror audiences reflected both admiration for the franchise's longevity and frustration with the increasingly extreme direction of the sequels. Some viewers appreciated the movie's attempt to expand the mythology and psychological themes of the series, while others believed the film relied too heavily on gore, exploitation, and disturbing content without delivering strong storytelling. To understand why the critical response became so divided, it is important to first understand the place Wrong Turn 6 occupied within the franchise itself. The original Wrong Turn film, released in 2003, introduced audiences to a terrifying survival horror story centered on travelers trapped in the wilderness and hunted by deformed cannibal killers. The movie starred Eliza Dushku as Jessie, one of the survivors struggling to escape the mutant hillbillies hidden in the forests of West Virginia. At the time, the original film stood out because it combined several classic horror elements effectively. It used isolated wilderness settings, brutal practical effects, suspenseful chase sequences, and grotesque villains inspired by fears of hidden rural communities disconnected from civilization. The success of the original movie eventually led to multiple sequels, creating a franchise that continued for years despite mostly bypassing major theatrical releases. By 2014, the series had reached 6 installments, which was impressive for a modern horror property. The mention of 10 years since Eliza Dushku's appearance highlights how unexpectedly durable the franchise became. Many horror series disappear after 1 or 2 sequels, especially lower-budget slasher films. However, Wrong Turn continued producing new entries because it maintained a loyal fanbase interested in violent survival horror and cannibal-themed terror. The franchise's longevity also reflected a broader trend in horror cinema during the 2000s and early 2010s. Audiences during that era showed strong interest in extreme horror films emphasizing gore, brutality, and psychological discomfort. Movies involving torture, isolation, and graphic violence became increasingly popular among dedicated horror fans. The Wrong Turn series fit perfectly into this trend. Each sequel attempted to escalate the violence and shock value, often featuring increasingly gruesome death scenes and darker themes. However, long-running horror franchises face a difficult problem over time: repetition. Once audiences become familiar with the basic formula, filmmakers often try introducing new ideas or shocking twists to keep the series fresh. This is exactly what Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort attempted to do. Instead of focusing only on strangers being hunted through the woods, the 6th film explored themes of inheritance, family corruption, psychological manipulation, and identity. Danny, the protagonist, was not simply another victim. He was connected by blood to the cannibal clan itself. This shift changed the structure of the story dramatically. Earlier Wrong Turn movies focused mainly on survival and escape. In Wrong Turn 6, the horror also came from watching Danny slowly abandon morality and become part of the evil surrounding Hobbs Springs. Some critics and horror fans appreciated this ambition. Joel Harley's positive reaction reflected the viewpoint of viewers who believed the franchise needed evolution rather than endless repetition. When Harley described the movie as one of the best entries yet, that praise likely came from several aspects of the film that distinguished it from previous sequels. One reason some fans enjoyed Wrong Turn 6 was its atmosphere. The abandoned resort of Hobbs Springs created a gothic and unsettling environment different from the forests and cabins used heavily in earlier installments. The decaying architecture, underground bathhouse, hidden tunnels, and isolated mountain setting gave the movie a more mysterious and psychological tone. The film also attempted to deepen the mythology surrounding the cannibal family. Instead of portraying them only as savage monsters, the story introduced the idea of a hidden bloodline with traditions, rituals, and a corrupt legacy passed down through generations. For some horror fans, this added complexity made the film more interesting. The psychological manipulation used by Jackson and Sally created tension beyond simple physical survival. Danny's gradual transformation into part of the cannibal family introduced tragedy and moral conflict into the story. Another aspect some viewers appreciated was the film's willingness to embrace dark and disturbing themes completely. Wrong Turn 6 does not attempt to soften its horror elements or provide comforting resolutions. It remains bleak, violent, and morally twisted from beginning to end. Horror fans who enjoy extreme cinema often value movies willing to push boundaries without restraint. For those viewers, the disturbing atmosphere and tragic ending may have felt refreshing compared to more predictable slasher formulas. The movie's practical gore effects also appealed to fans of old-school horror violence. The franchise had built its identity around graphic practical effects, mutilation scenes, and grotesque cannibal imagery. Wrong Turn 6 continued this tradition with brutal attacks, dismemberment, and disturbing rituals. The performances of certain cast members also received praise from some critics and viewers. Sadie Katz, in particular, stood out for her portrayal of Sally. Sally is one of the film's most unsettling characters because she combines psychological instability, seduction, manipulation, and violence. Sadie Katz portrayed the character with unpredictable energy, making Sally feel emotionally dangerous even before her full madness becomes clear. Her performance added personality to a movie filled with brutality. Rather than behaving like a simple horror villain, Sally constantly shifts between friendliness, emotional instability, and cruelty. Even critics who disliked the movie overall often acknowledged that Katz brought intensity and commitment to the role. However, despite some positive reactions, Wrong Turn 6 also received extremely negative criticism from many reviewers and audience members. Steve Barton's harsh response, calling the film all crap with a few good moments, reflected the frustration many critics felt toward the movie's storytelling and content. One major criticism involved the film's reliance on exploitation and shock value. While the Wrong Turn franchise always contained graphic violence, Wrong Turn 6 pushed into especially disturbing territory involving sexual violence, cannibalistic rituals, and psychological manipulation. For some viewers, these elements felt excessive rather than meaningful. Critics argued that the movie used shocking material mainly to provoke discomfort instead of building strong suspense or emotional depth. The sexual content especially divided audiences. Several scenes combined intimacy with violence in ways many viewers found disturbing or unnecessary. Some critics believed these moments crossed the line from horror into exploitation. Another major criticism involved the pacing and structure of the story. Some viewers felt the movie spent too much time on Danny's internal conflict without making him emotionally compelling enough as a protagonist. Danny's transformation from ordinary young man into cannibal family leader was meant to feel tragic and psychologically complex. However, some critics believed the writing failed to develop his character deeply enough, making his decisions frustrating rather than emotionally powerful. This created another problem for audiences. Danny eventually becomes difficult to sympathize with. As he grows more attached to Jackson and Sally, viewers may lose emotional connection to him. Unlike traditional horror protagonists who fight against evil, Danny gradually embraces it. For some viewers, this dark transformation felt bold and interesting. For others, it made the story emotionally unpleasant and difficult to invest in. The movie's ending especially divided critics. Instead of defeating the cannibal family or escaping the nightmare, Danny ultimately becomes part of it. 1 year later, he is managing the reopened resort and continuing the family's horrifying traditions. This ending rejects the hopeful survival themes found in many slasher films. Evil does not lose in Wrong Turn 6. Instead, it absorbs the protagonist completely. Some horror fans appreciated the bleakness of this conclusion because it felt unpredictable and disturbing. Others believed it left the story feeling hopeless and nihilistic without emotional payoff. This transformed what may have been viewed as a simple background prop into a deeply painful issue for the missing woman's family and loved ones. The key problem was not simply the use of a random photograph. The emotional weight came from the fact that the woman was genuinely missing in real life, meaning her disappearance represented an ongoing tragedy rather than fictional horror material. For the family, seeing a real missing loved one's image used in a violent horror movie would have been shocking and distressing. Horror films involving murder, cannibalism, and graphic violence are designed to entertain audiences through fear and suspense, but the use of an actual missing person's image unintentionally connected real grief to fictional brutality. This is why the controversy quickly escalated into a court case. In October 2014, legal action was filed in Ireland concerning the unauthorized use of the photograph. The case immediately drew public attention because it raised important ethical questions about responsibility in filmmaking, especially regarding the use of images found online or in public records. The situation highlighted how modern film production sometimes relies on digital materials gathered quickly from various sources. In some cases, background images or props may be selected without fully verifying their origins. However, when such mistakes involve real victims or sensitive situations, the consequences can become severe. The court initially declined to issue a temporary injunction against the film. A temporary injunction would have immediately stopped distribution or exhibition while legal proceedings continued. Although this request was denied at first, the controversy did not disappear. Instead, the case returned to court in early November 2014, keeping public attention focused on the issue. What made the situation especially damaging for the movie was the emotional nature of the complaint. This was not simply a technical copyright dispute or a disagreement over intellectual property. It involved the image of a real person connected to a painful unresolved disappearance. Because of this, the controversy created significant reputational problems for both the film and its distributor. 20th Century Fox, which distributed the movie through Fox Home Entertainment, responded dramatically by recalling all DVD and Blu-ray copies of Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort. This decision was highly unusual, especially for a direct-to-video horror release. Movie recalls are rare because physical media distribution involves large production costs, manufacturing processes, shipping logistics, and retailer agreements. Recalling already distributed copies means accepting financial losses to prevent further circulation of problematic material. The recall demonstrated how seriously the distributor viewed the controversy. Even though the issue involved a brief background image rather than a central part of the story, the emotional and legal implications were significant enough to justify pulling the film from circulation. The distributor also removed the movie from online streaming platforms. This step was important because digital streaming had become one of the main ways audiences accessed horror films by 2014. Removing the movie from streaming services effectively made it temporarily unavailable to most viewers. This reaction reveals how modern media companies often prioritize avoiding prolonged controversy, especially when sensitive real-life situations are involved. Continuing to distribute the movie without addressing the issue could have caused even greater public backlash. The situation also reflected changing standards in media responsibility during the digital age. As access to images and information became easier online, filmmakers and studios faced greater pressure to verify the origin of materials used in productions. The controversy surrounding Wrong Turn 6 became an example of how seemingly small production decisions can create major ethical consequences. Another reason the case attracted attention was because the Wrong Turn franchise already had a reputation for graphic violence and disturbing content. Critics often accused the series of relying heavily on shock value and exploitation. The accidental inclusion of a real missing woman's image intensified those criticisms because it seemed to connect fictional exploitation with actual tragedy. Even though there was no indication that the filmmakers intentionally used the photograph to exploit the real case, the emotional impact remained powerful. The horror genre frequently explores themes of death, disappearance, and violence, but audiences generally accept these themes because they exist within fictional boundaries. Once a real missing person became connected to the movie, those boundaries became blurred. The incident also sparked discussion about the ethical responsibilities of filmmakers when creating realistic horror environments. Many horror films use fake missing person posters, fabricated newspaper articles, or fictional victim photographs to build atmosphere. The Wrong Turn 6 controversy showed why careful verification is essential when using any real-world materials in fiction. The emotional dimension of the case cannot be overstated. Families of missing persons often live with years of uncertainty, grief, and psychological trauma. Seeing a loved one's image associated with fictional cannibalistic violence could intensify that pain significantly. This explains why the issue became more than a simple legal matter. It involved dignity, respect, and sensitivity toward real human suffering. Eventually, the movie was re-released with the controversial photograph blurred out. This solution allowed the film to return to circulation while removing the problematic image. The decision to blur the photograph rather than permanently ban the film reflected an attempt to balance artistic distribution with ethical responsibility. The filmmakers and distributor could continue releasing the movie while ensuring the real missing woman's image no longer appeared visibly on screen. However, the controversy permanently affected the reputation of Wrong Turn 6. Even people unfamiliar with the plot or characters often became aware of the film because of the court case and recall. In some ways, the legal controversy overshadowed discussion about the movie itself. Instead of focusing only on the story, performances, or horror elements, many conversations about the film centered on the recall and ethical issues surrounding the photograph. This had both negative and unusual effects on the movie's legacy. On one hand, the controversy damaged the film's reputation and associated it with a painful real-world issue. On the other hand, the incident made Wrong Turn 6 one of the most talked-about entries in the franchise because recalls and legal disputes are relatively rare in horror cinema. The situation also reflected broader tensions between horror entertainment and public sensitivity. Horror movies are designed to provoke fear, discomfort, and emotional reactions, but filmmakers must still navigate ethical boundaries when dealing with imagery connected to real-world suffering. The Wrong Turn 6 controversy became a reminder that realism in horror carries risks. The more realistic fictional worlds become, the more careful productions must be to avoid unintentionally involving actual tragedies. This incident also revealed the speed at which controversies can spread during the digital era. News about the lawsuit circulated quickly online, allowing audiences worldwide to learn about the issue almost immediately. Social media and entertainment news websites amplified public discussion, increasing pressure on the distributor to respond decisively. In earlier decades, such controversies might have remained local or relatively unknown. By 2014, however, global online communication made it difficult for studios to ignore public criticism. The recall itself became historically unusual within horror franchise history. Many controversial horror films continue circulating despite criticism, but Wrong Turn 6 faced actual withdrawal from shelves and streaming services. This gave the movie an almost infamous status among horror fans. Some collectors became interested in original unedited copies because recalled films often gain curiosity value within fan communities. At the same time, the controversy forced audiences to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between horror entertainment and real-life tragedy. Horror often draws inspiration from real fears, crimes, disappearances, and violence. However, there is a major ethical difference between fictional inspiration and directly involving actual victims or missing persons. The court case highlighted the importance of consent and respect in visual media. Real individuals and families connected to tragedy cannot simply become background material for fictional entertainment without emotional consequences. The response from the distributor showed recognition of this principle. By recalling the film and editing the image, the company acknowledged that the issue required correction rather than dismissal. From a production perspective, the controversy likely influenced how future horror films handled background materials and prop design. Studios became more aware of the need to carefully verify images and documents used in fictional settings. The incident also demonstrates how small details in filmmaking can have enormous consequences. The photograph reportedly appeared only briefly, yet that single image affected the entire distribution history of the movie. For the Wrong Turn franchise, the controversy became an unusual chapter in a series already known for violence and disturbing imagery. Unlike debates about gore or exploitation, this issue involved genuine human sensitivity rather than artistic taste. Some viewers who might normally defend extreme horror content still viewed the photograph controversy as deeply troubling because it crossed from fictional violence into real emotional pain. At the same time, many discussions acknowledged that the use of the image was likely accidental rather than malicious. There was no evidence suggesting the filmmakers intentionally targeted the missing woman or her family. However, accidental harm can still carry serious emotional and ethical consequences. The controversy demonstrated how oversight and negligence in production processes can create real-world damage even without malicious intent. In retrospect, the Wrong Turn 6 court case remains one of the most unusual controversies connected to a modern horror sequel. The combination of legal action, recalled home media releases, streaming removal, and eventual re-editing created a situation rarely seen in genre filmmaking. The incident transformed the movie from just another direct-to-video horror sequel into a cautionary example about media responsibility, ethical filmmaking, and the unintended consequences of using real-world materials in fictional horror environments. Ultimately, this controversy became significant not because of the movie's violence or story, but because it reminded audiences and filmmakers alike that horror entertainment exists within a real world where images, identities, and tragedies belong to actual people. The recall and re-release with the image blurred reflected an attempt to correct that mistake and separate fictional horror from real human suffering. The reviews of Wrong Turn 6: Last Resort were highly divided and reflected the complicated position the movie occupied within the horror genre and the Wrong Turn franchise itself. By the time the sixth installment was released in 2014, audiences already knew what to expect from the series: graphic violence, isolated wilderness settings, cannibalistic killers, and brutal survival horror. However, Wrong Turn 6 attempted to add deeper psychological themes and a darker storyline involving inheritance, manipulation, and family corruption. Because of this, the film received both praise and criticism from different groups of viewers and reviewers. For some horror fans, the movie represented one of the boldest entries in the franchise because it tried to expand the mythology of the cannibal family rather than simply repeating the same formula. Others believed the movie became too disturbing, exploitative, and emotionally unpleasant, relying more on shock value than strong storytelling. The divided reviews reveal how horror audiences often value very different things in movies. Some viewers prioritize atmosphere, gore, and disturbing imagery, while others focus more on writing, character development, and emotional impact. Wrong Turn 6 attempted to satisfy both groups but ended up creating strong disagreement instead. One of the most common positive reactions involved the movie's atmosphere. Many viewers agreed that Hobbs Springs, the abandoned mountain resort where the story takes place, created a memorable and unsettling setting. Unlike earlier films in the franchise that mainly used forests and cabins, Wrong Turn 6 introduced a decaying resort filled with hidden tunnels, underground bathhouses, old rooms, and dark hallways. Reviewers who enjoyed the film often praised this location because it gave the movie a gothic and mysterious tone. The resort feels haunted by secrets and violence long before the full truth about the cannibal family is revealed. The aging architecture and isolated mountain environment create constant tension, making viewers feel trapped alongside the characters. Some reviews described the setting as one of the movie's strongest elements because it gave the story a more psychological atmosphere than previous entries. Instead of relying only on chase scenes and killings, the film used the environment itself to create fear. The visual presentation also received mixed but sometimes positive attention. Supporters of the film appreciated the darker cinematography, dim lighting, and grim mood. The movie often feels dirty, cold, and decayed, which matches the themes of corruption and hidden evil. For fans of extreme horror cinema, this grim visual style added to the disturbing atmosphere. The movie never attempts to appear glamorous or polished. Instead, it embraces ugliness and discomfort completely. However, some reviewers criticized the same visual style for making the movie feel too dark or cheap. Certain viewers believed the lighting and camera work lacked clarity, especially during action sequences and attacks. Another major topic in reviews involved the performances of the cast, especially Sadie Katz as Sally and Chris Jarvis as Jackson. Sadie Katz's portrayal of Sally became one of the most praised aspects of the film even among critics who otherwise disliked it. Sally is unpredictable, emotionally unstable, manipulative, and frightening in ways different from the mutant cannibal killers. Reviewers often described her as unsettling because she constantly shifts between friendliness, seduction, madness, and cruelty. Her strange behavior creates tension even during scenes without violence. Many critics believed Sadie Katz brought energy and personality to the movie. In a franchise filled with graphic gore and mutant killers, Sally stood out because she felt psychologically dangerous rather than simply monstrous. Chris Jarvis also received attention for his portrayal of Jackson. Unlike the savage cannibal brothers, Jackson behaves calmly and intelligently. He manipulates Danny emotionally throughout the movie, encouraging him to embrace the Hilliker family legacy. Reviewers who appreciated the film often praised Jackson because he introduced psychological horror into the story. Instead of relying only on physical violence, Jackson represents emotional corruption and manipulation. The relationship between Danny, Jackson, and Sally became one of the movie's most discussed elements. Some viewers liked the way the story slowly transformed Danny from an outsider into part of the cannibal family. This character transformation distinguished Wrong Turn 6 from earlier entries in the franchise. Previous films mostly focused on survivors trying to escape the cannibals. In contrast, Danny gradually becomes connected to them through inheritance and bloodline. Some reviews praised this darker approach because it added tragedy and psychological conflict to the story. Danny's desire for belonging makes him vulnerable to manipulation, which creates emotional tension beyond ordinary slasher storytelling. Supporters of the film argued that this psychological angle made Wrong Turn 6 more ambitious than many direct-to-video horror sequels. However, other reviewers strongly disliked Danny's storyline. One common criticism was that Danny became frustrating and unsympathetic as the movie progressed. At the beginning of the story, Danny appears curious and uncertain about his family history. But as he falls deeper under Jackson and Sally's influence, he starts turning against his friends and ignoring obvious danger. Many critics felt the movie failed to make Danny emotionally compelling enough for audiences to fully understand his transformation. Instead of feeling tragic, some viewers saw his decisions as irrational or annoying. This created a major problem for certain audiences because horror movies often rely on viewers emotionally supporting the protagonist. As Danny becomes more corrupted, some reviewers lost interest in his survival entirely. The ending especially divided critics and fans. In many slasher films, surviving characters defeat evil or escape danger, creating some sense of victory or hope. Wrong Turn 6 rejects this formula completely. By the end of the movie, Danny fully embraces the cannibal family legacy, allowing Tony to die and eventually becoming the new manager of the resort. Some reviewers praised this bleak ending because it felt disturbing and unpredictable. Instead of destroying the evil family, the protagonist becomes part of it. Fans of darker psychological horror appreciated this tragic conclusion because it emphasized corruption and moral collapse rather than heroic survival. However, many critics hated the ending for exactly the same reason. They felt the story became nihilistic and emotionally unpleasant without providing satisfying payoff. Tony's death in particular frustrated many viewers because she spent most of the movie trying to save Danny and uncover the truth. Her violent death after Danny abandons her made the conclusion feel cruel and hopeless. The movie's violence and gore also became major subjects in reviews. The Wrong Turn franchise had already developed a reputation for graphic kill scenes, and Wrong Turn 6 continued that tradition with brutal dismemberments, cannibalistic rituals, and bloody attacks. Fans of gore-heavy horror often praised the practical effects and extreme violence. For viewers who enjoy exploitation horror and slasher films, the graphic content delivered exactly what they expected from the franchise. The mutant cannibal brothers, Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye, continued providing grotesque physical horror throughout the movie. Their appearance and attacks reinforced the franchise's identity as brutal survival horror.